Welcome to everybody that's joined us today. So very pleased to be part of this adaptation afternoon at the Standards Pavilion here today. We're going to cover a very important topic today related to adaptation. We all know that this is a multi-trillion-dollar challenge that's facing the globe. And so today, what we want to do is put a bit of a focus on how you can develop a solid roadmap, the foundations of a good adaptation strategy. And so we'll be putting a spotlight on planning, risk, and vulnerability assessment today, but with a particular focus on standards and the concrete tools that we can use to form the basis of a solid adaptation plan. So I'd like to start by introducing the panel that we have joining us here today. I'll start on the far end with my colleague Benoit Deforge, who is the Vice President of the Energy Directorate at Measurement Canada, but who joins us today in his capacity as the subcommittee chair to ISO's Environmental Management Committee focused on GHG and climate change management, this TC207. In the middle here, joining us today is Veronica Scotti, who is the chairperson for Public Sector Solutions at Swiss Re. And joining me just to my left here is Tafara Smith, who is the acting director of the Standards Division at the Bureau of Standards, Jamaica. So I'd like to start us off with a broad question, but to get some important perspectives on the nature of the challenge before we dive into the specifics of the tools themselves. And so we all know that extreme weather is increasingly causing extensive damage in the order of billions of dollars, in addition to causing long-term health, safety, and social impacts in economies all over the world. As we increasingly feel the impacts of climate change, it's no longer enough to react and repair. I think we've hit the point where we realize that more needs to be done. So the question that I'd like to put to the panel to start us off is, how can communities balance present and future needs, but also take a long-term planning approach, and what are the challenges of doing so? And I'd like to start with you, Tafara, to provide a bit of a regional perspective on the question.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And it's a pleasure being here and being invited to participate and to offer our regional perspective, especially for us in the Caribbean. But based on our location, we are very prone to some of the detrimental and impact of climate change, characterized by the storms or long droughts and so forth. I think one of the things that us as a region will need to do, and we're trying to communicate with our regional standard body, which is CROSQ, Caribbean Regional Organization for Standards and Quality, is to develop a proactive response and to do proper planning in regards to identifying the risk and putting systems in place to combat these risks. Resilient-based planning, of course. So we'll look at climate risk assessment, strengthen our building codes. We have a Caribbean unified building code, and as well as Jamaica itself would have revised recently its building codes, national building codes. We are also looking into nature-based solutions. One of the things that Jamaica is actively looking at is preserving our wetlands, putting back, planting, replanting, preserving the ecosystem as it relates to our coral reef, replanting our mangrove, as these are natural barriers that can help us in time of disaster. Looking at sustainable infrastructure as it relates to renewable energy solutions. We have a Caribbean Regional Energy Efficiency Standard. We also have the National Energy Efficiency Standard for Jamaica. We had benefited from World Bank funding to upgrade our labs to test these appliances to ensure that they are indeed energy efficient. We're also looking at water management systems and standards that support water management in terms of rainwater harvesting and infrastructure for water storage. Jamaica, of course, like I said, we suffer long droughts, and so this is very important to us. Also very important regionally is capacity building. what we find is that experts sometimes they're limited, and where we do have persons in certain critical positions like local government, there is need for capacity development, and so we are looking into these and seeking to identify funding to support capacity development and support the development of skills in these critical persons.
Thanks for that, Tafara. I think it gives us a bit of a view into a systematic approach, but also an approach that's based on the specific risks that you're seeing in your region and in your country. And so I'd like to turn to you, Veronica, because I think you can provide a bit of an industry perspective on this, but I'm also aware that Swiss Re has recently done a case study on flooding, which points to the need for cost-benefit analysis, which provides us another lens on how we can really apply that systematic approach. So I'd like to get a bit of your perspective on the question.
Thank you, Brady, and thank you for inviting me. I really believe standards are fundamental in the ecosystem to adaptation, especially when they are appropriately implemented. It's very important that we implement them. So from a bigger picture perspective, you said, this is a runaway cost that we can't afford to ignore going forward. And I would agree, 280 billion of losses last year in economic losses related to climate events that in some way could have been avoided or substantially contained if we have a safer and more resilient built environment. And so as a global reinsurer, we believe this is a trend that we should expect and prepare for as escalating. 30 years ago, the incidence of losses on GDP was half of what it is today. 30 years from now, we're looking at tripling that incidence to maybe 14% of a GDP. That's on average globally. So it's a real cost to our economies. Now, you're right, we do believe that there is a real value in adaptation interventions, and the numbers range between 1 to 10 times to maybe sometimes more. But the challenge is, as I think everyone on this group knows, is the ability to translate that into a financial cash flow model, because the concept of loss avoided is not something that you can bank typically, which is why as a company last year at COP28, we actually launched this concept of the cost-benefit ratio to make sure that every adaptation that we know needs to be specific can be modeled and analyzed in such a way that we can look at the impact of such intervention with or without an adaptation under different climate scenarios. And we've used, last year it was about heat waves and flood. This year we've done a double down of our analysis on flood specifically. And we found that most intervention will create a benefit of 2 to 1 or even 10 to 1 when it comes to flood. What is really critical is that our analysis shows when it comes to coastal flooding, we could actually reduce the cost if we did the right interventions at the right standards with the right deployment by 98%. The economic losses could be reduced by 98%. And if you look at river-related flooding, by the right infrastructure intervention, again, we could actually reduce that by 75%. So if you consider that flooding today costs the economy around 52 billion, and it's going to triple in its size, you can see how much of that money could go into adaptation. So how do we create the appropriate system of incentives through insurance, amongst other things, so that the codes are rightly applied, and with those, that risk reduction really shines through. And I can maybe give later some examples of where we've seen this cost benefit really come to life, also from an insurance pricing reduction as a result.
Thank you very much for that. And I think the statistics are sobering, the numbers are sobering in terms of the cost. I mean, just imagining the ability of some economies to absorb that kind of hit, it's quite extreme. And so it does speak to the importance of that systematic approach, and really appreciate how that cost-benefit lens can help us to make sure that we're making the right investments and the right interventions. So I want to shift over to Benoit then to talk a little bit about specific tools that we have in our toolkit that can get us started in terms of thinking about that adaptation planning pathway, and how we can integrate things like risk and vulnerability assessment and do that kind of cost-benefit analysis. And so, from your perspective as chair of the committee that's responsible for ISO's adaptation, vulnerability, and risk assessment standard, can you provide us a little bit of a perspective on how that tool can help to get us started?
Thank you. Thank you, Brady. Sorry. Yeah, in fact, what I'm listening here with my colleagues talking, we're talking about impact. We're talking about the effect of climate change. We're talking about the risk, and this is what we have here. The tools that Brady is talking about is standards that have been put together, very recent standard over the last few years that really help in identifying the risk and preparing for the planning. So there's a set of standards, the family of standards, ISO, that my group put together over the last few years that are very recent, like 14090, 91, 92, 93, that really can be applied and are flexible enough to be used in any country or any organizations. And at the beginning, it provides an overview, but then one of the standards provide the risk assessment, how to identify the key points, the key risk, depending on your organization, who should be involved. And then we're moving to, after that, like a more standards where you look at the planning, how to plan for this. And the beauty of this, when you look at the planning, when you read those standards, the standards very often is very hard to read. It's very cold, But for these, for people who probably did project management of their life, things like that, this is how it's developed. This is how it's laid out, and it's very easy to understand. It's a project management, including some very key points regarding climate.
Thanks for that, Benoit. And I wouldn't mind diving a little bit deeper on that, because I think it would be useful to talk a little bit about the meat of what's in the tool, and starting with the importance of a structured risk assessment. You mentioned that this is a process that those that are involved in managing complex projects are familiar with, and so we're using language that practitioners are already familiar with, but we're adding that climate change lens.
But it's front and center in any ISO development. Anything that you do, you need a collaboration, you need a discussion with the different stakeholders and the input to ensure that what you have is really meeting the need of your stakeholders. And after that, once you're done with the risk assessment, you look at how to inform your audience and your people inside your stakeholders. But one of the very most important thing when you do your risk assessment for your plan is the timing. So the time, you need to set the horizon. When you talk about an adaptation, you're not necessarily talking about 5 years, 10 years. You're talking 25, 30, 35, because we have to look long term. If you're looking at a time horizon that is too small, you might not have the right adaptation plan for the hazards. So you need to look at that, and usually we recommend around 30 years. Could be before, or depending where you are in which country, might be a little bit different. But it's when we're looking ahead, it makes sense. So, okay. So the first thing after that is the pre-planning. This is the part of the next standard, which is the planning, the adaptation planning. The pre-planning is very important because you have to put your team, the right team in place for the adaptation plan. So who's going to be the decision maker, the people who's going to decide about this plan. So the facilitation team, the interested parties. Interested parties is very important. Who will it affect? You need to have a word to say in your plan. So you need to look at that as well. And developing your policy, your framework for the plan itself. The next point, when you look at the, sorry. All right. After that, you have to put together your plan. So you look at the planning, potential adaptation measures, you look at the options. What are all the options that you need to look at? And after that, decide and assess the adaptation measures based also on your risk assessment that you've previously done, and you arrive to a decision of what should be our plan. Again, it's all in collaboration with all the different stakeholders that you have. And finally, the reporting, the communication. You can have the best plan in the world, but you need to communicate. You need to ensure that all the stakeholders are there, and it needs to be also, accurate, but also flexible, depending on your what you want to do. And the communication, you need to target the audience and ensure that you have the right audience, and providing input, because it's a cycle. You're going to report, communicate, and get feedback to potentially adjust your plan. Like I said, it's very, although it's all related to climate change, but it's a project management plan that you're going to put together.
Thanks for that, Benoit. And it shows us the nature of the structured approach, something that I think those of us that are involved in managing projects can really understand and grapple with. You focused in on stakeholders, and to me that strikes me as a particularly important aspect of this, because I think at the end of the day, we're looking at assets, and that might influence your time scale. Like a building, we're not going to be looking at 10, 20 years. We'll be looking at 50, perhaps beyond. But when we look at people, I think we also need to consider different populations and vulnerable populations, who's going to be impacted most. And I just wondered, before I switch back to other members of the panel, if you have a perspective on how this can really help us to focus in on those who will be impacted the most, and how we can really mitigate the harms to them.
Well, yeah, what you're talking about is the interested parties. And interested parties are key front and center in this standard. So we're talking, could be people in the cities, like elderly people with older that could be really affected by climate change. Could be the rural people economy there for farmers, for example, could be very well affected. We're talking about children too. Children, we're talking about climate anxiety. Well, that's one point. I know we're talking larger scale, but that's what it is. All those, also the workers that are working outside, it's a big part of the interested parties. They will be affected, so you need to put potentially an adaptation plan for them. So because people working could be in transportation, could be just outside, like restaurants or whatever, it might have an impact. So there are a large suite of different people that could be really affected by climate change, and they need to be considered and also brought in a discussion.
Thanks for that, Benoit. I think it speaks to the importance of the stakeholder engagement piece, and also making sure that we do a really good job of systematically identifying those communities that need to be involved in a good adaptation plan. And I know certainly in the Canadian context, when we look at some of the effects that we've had, using this type of approach has helped us to put, for instance, a spotlight on the fact that it is the elderly who have suffered, for instance, the most from extreme heat. And that's where we've seen a lot of deaths in recent years, and it helps us to lift up that signal and figure out that we do need a specific response.
One more that I forgot is the indigenous communities, because very often the indigenous communities, they don't live in the city, they can be affected. I'm talking about Canada, but I know it's the same thing with many other countries, so that's another very important interested party.
Thanks for that. And so I want to shift to you now, Tafar, to provide a little bit of a regional perspective as well on this, because we can see that Jamaica is taking very much a systematic approach to this, and one that's looking at where those key risk areas are and where those key vulnerabilities are. And so maybe you'd be willing to speak to how a structured process like this has helped to inform the planning and the action that you've been taking in your country.
Sure. All right, sure. So this year, Jamaica has been actively involved in its National Adaptation Plan, risk assessment, and like Benoit, like Benoit shared, one of the things that we have done is, in this risk assessment, is to identify those areas that are of critical importance or will be have the most impact when we are affected by these superstorms or droughts, right? And what we did is identify flood-prone areas, and the strategy that you'd use for that area would be different from the areas that we would have identified for that has probably weak bridge system, weak infrastructure, and as well as, so we have flood-prone areas, the weak infrastructure, the agricultural areas, tourism areas, the areas that are now affected by, what do you call it? Affecting our shores. We're losing, what is it? I'm sorry, coastal. Right, so the coastal areas where, so depending on the different areas that would have identified in our risk assessment, it helps us to plan for those areas and to prioritize our resources into concentrating mitigation action, especially in those particular areas. And so, one of the things that we are now doing is engaging strongly with the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation to help them to integrate these standards as well, reference them into their policies that they're developing. This now helps to bring about some long-term effect and as well as continuity. So we're not just identifying areas now and doing actions now. The risk assessment is helping us to see where we really need to have other long-term plans as well. But there are some challenges, of course, because like I said before, we have limited resources. And so because we're affected now, sometimes the focus is on addressing the now and putting those resources in addressing the now compared to investing. But we as a standard body, we're trying to get them to see and understand and to agree with us that these activities, the long-term activities, are also critically important to reap long-term benefit and to mitigate against the detrimental effect or the impact, the level of impact that these climate change activities can have on us.
Thanks for that in-country and regional perspective. You spoke about the work that you're doing to engage with policymakers and other communities to encourage the use of standards and help them to understand the importance and the value of using standards, not only as they do their planning, but also as they move forward with specific adaptive actions and solutions. And I wondered if you have any advice for us around how you do that policy. How can we effectively convince people of the value of these tools? Any lessons that you'd be willing to share with us from that?
Okay, all right. So one of the things within the developing country, the priority again is the no. Let's look at, for example, businesses. Businesses go into business to make money, and when we approach them about climate change and the need to consider climate change in their planning, the focus or the acceptance is not so readily forthcoming. And so one of the things that we do is we do capacity building activities, we do public awareness sessions, and so this has helped them from us to understand the requirements in the standards, the benefits of using the standards now, and to understand while you might not get immediate benefit, that there are benefits for the future which are long term. For our ministry officials, they do get the message, they do understand, and so they have come on board and have partnered with us and reach out to us a lot of times independently. Instead of us going after them, they reach out to us to ask us for help in terms of identifying standards that are relevant to climate change, asking for assistance as to how do we reference them. So there are different referencing styles that we share with them, just to make sure that as standards change, or regulation doesn't need that updating, because it's a long and tedious process. Right, and so those are some of the ways. Also, we engage with academia because we want to get the message in schools and get from the school level the research, right, to help to support the planning process and to provide data to us to help us to make good decisions, as well as monitoring. Because one of the things that we are doing now is monitoring land use. How have the land surface changed over time? Or agricultural spaces which are now being used as residential spaces, what impact does that have for climate change? Greenhouse gas absorption of carbon dioxide, is less when you remove these green spaces, right? And so it's critical that we engage with these stakeholders again as well, with our consumer groups. When we do get consumers to understand the benefits of standard, then they demand that from industry, and then we see that change in industry that helps them, bring about the general change that we want for Jamaica as well as the rest of the Caribbean.
Thanks so much, Tafara, for sharing that experience with us and some of the insights into what's important in terms of that communication. And I particularly like the focus on benefits and costs, which I think Veronica spoke to quite a bit earlier. And so I'd like to shift it to you and get a bit of a perspective from you about how can we lift that piece out and do it really well, and point to how these tools can really help us to assess and understand those costs, but also communicate the benefits of acting and responding, but also using the tools to do it well.
Yeah, Tafara and Benoit really lined it up beautifully, because I think standards ultimately help build confidence for those who have little time and little money and have to take really important decisions. So how do you know what good looks like? I think that's fundamentally the role of standards. Notwithstanding that the decisions rest with the decision and the risk owners, but it's just really building a lot of confidence in the system. And so today, at least my organization, the industry broadly, uses the standards, the ISO standards, and I really love what you presented, the 14,090, 91, 92. They just build off each other, because it's an important frame of reference. We really use them three ways. Firstly, for every project that we are invited to analyze, big infrastructure projects that we underwrite, we actually use the standards as part of our risk engineering assessment before we put our money, and we can put hundreds of millions of risk capital behind these projects. We use the standards to assess if the project that we're going to take on, whether it's in development or already operational, is up to standard. So, so that's for us a really important linchpin. The second thing is, obviously, by doing that, we create an incentive for adaptation. Because if the execution of the project is not up to standard, the price is going to go up. If the execution of the project is up to standard, the price is going to go down, right? It's very direct. That transmits very clearly. So that price signal is an important. You are asking what are the incentives. I hope this is an incentive. Typically, money talks. And lastly, I love what Benoit said before. You need to take at least a 20, 30-year view, right? That's what the WMO recommends. You mentioned, Brady, that it may take even longer for certain projects. Well, our tool and our analytics are really designed to help plan in the very, very long term. So if you allow me, I'd like to give 2 or 3 examples concretely. So from the point of the analytics, today we have an ability to take climate scenarios we have 190 models of all possible shocks that could happen, and you can project them out aligned with IPCC scenarios all the way to the end of the century. And you can look at this, how the climate may evolve specifically to your location, to your particular assets, to your particular economic activities. That can inform policy that you're referring to before. So in the case of the Mutual of Councils in Australia, this tool was deployed for the purpose of land use planning and giving permits. Now that doesn't mean that you stop economic activity because an area is flood prone, but you build it to a standard that has vulnerability at the core of its design. So if you can build in a way that you take care of that vulnerability, not just one singular building, but everything that goes with that, right? At community level is well protected, then that is completely an investable case. But if you're doing it without that consideration, I guarantee you that area is going to flood not once every 10 years, but once every 2 years. And those will become stranded assets, and that will have an impact on banking, mortgage, economic activities, and so on and so forth. So standards become at that point a crucial component piece of bringing that policy to life. The second example I want to give is the work that we've been doing, because heat was mentioned before. It's the work that we've been doing around extreme heat again, with the Sydney Coalition. And here we're using our insights as well as the ability to protect populations that otherwise would be excluded. So it's a truly multi-stakeholder approach. How do we build the the future Sydney, Greater Sydney area, in such a way that heat is something that we know how to co-live with. That changes the material you use, that changes the way you move around, that changes the protection you need, and insurance can be, again, an incentive towards that, and be able to embed it as part of that design process. And what I love about the Great Sydney Challenge is that instead of looking at just from a risk perspective, it's seen also as a business opportunity. This means that construction companies, local authorities, they can create a new market for new products, for new ways of conducting businesses. So it doesn't have to be just a negative story. It can be a good economic development story. And then on Tafaresh mentioned before, it's not just about the gray infrastructure, but there is a nature component to it. Nature can be part of our adaptation. And I'll point to one example which is not obvious, but it was incredibly effective. We helped in the Netherlands, a dike was below standards and needed to be raised. And so that would have costed, it was a typical grey infrastructure. But we thought that it was a unique opportunity to actually integrate green, so with marram grasses and sand being put around this area. And the benefit of having that intervention is not only you get the population protected against flooding, because of course that was going to happen with very high probability over the next 10 years, but you actually have an environmental benefit, and the standards were upgraded as part of that design. The natural assets are treated as an asset, so they were protected through the insurance cover. They were not, so if there is any damage, it's protected as well. And you have economic activities that has developed around that. More people use it for, recreational use. Birds migration has been supported. So it is not one or the other. We can actually integrate. You can get fantastic economic activities in Jamaica. And I will say a shout out to the country of Jamaica, because the leadership has been fantastic. From roofing to, the disaster risk management, they really are leading in the Caribbean in this space.
Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you for the examples really bring it to life, right? And I'll start with the first one. Like, money talks, right? And I think you're making a very clear economic case for a variety of stakeholders in terms of why they need to embrace this process, and the importance that can have for the bottom line. And when I think about where we started our journey on standards for adaptation in Canada, that initial integration point was being able to apply the risk assessment for major investments in infrastructure, right? And so we're talking about big dollars, we're talking about large ecosystems of stakeholders, and we're talking about communities that are receiving this money. And so setting up the incentive structure is so important, and a structured risk assessment can be a tool that can help us to do that really, really well. And so the other elements that you highlighted there really also speak to the benefits side of the equation, and how you can get incentives right, not just in terms of what is it going to cost you, but what you can gain. And so maybe I'll shift back over to you, Benoit, because the standard here is perhaps particularly important. Could you share with us a little bit about how a structured process like this can help you to identify co-benefits and really help communities to take that holistic, or stakeholders, whoever might be needing to take that adaptive action, take that holistic view towards a solution?
Yes, because that's a good point. That when we look at the standardization, we hear different point of views, like the co-benefit, what you're talking about, from different side of the equation. We have different stakeholders from, could be on one side, against one of the points, and then somebody else is bringing another point. So what I mean by that is by having a suite of stakeholders, when we develop those type of standards, we get different views, and it makes it easier to adapt and get the necessary benefit at different side of the equation. So that's what, for me, it's important what we are doing, and the same way that when we are communicating the benefit of the standards, that's what we need to look at, how you can apply that and get benefit at different places.
Thanks for that. I think it speaks to how having a structured process and a framework that allows you to understand what are your key inputs, who are those key stakeholders, right?
Exactly.
How to get them put around the table, but then what are the benefits, what are the risks, how do you put those things together, but how do you then use a structured framework to weigh those things against each other and come out of that with something that's actually decision useful in terms of an adaptation plan. So thank you. And one of the other things that this kind of brings me back to, and I'm thinking back to your examples, Veronica, but the question is going to be for you, Tafara, because you talked about the importance of engaging policymakers, but also leadership, right? And I think you highlighted that as well. There's been excellent leadership in your country around this issue. Can you speak a little bit to the importance of that, but also how do we build the conditions for that?
Okay. All right. So, So one of the things that is critically important in terms of leadership is identifying those key stakeholders that the standard refers to. So based on the key stakeholders, including those that are in economy, our government, because one of the things that will happen and can happen is that we identify the benefits, and the benefits are to those persons that are bringing in the climate resilient tools or adaptive equipment that can be used, but you'll also find substandard equipment also coming into the country. And so the regulatory framework is very important to be robust, so not just monitor the quality of the equipment coming in so that they are indeed up to standard. One of the things I've seen recently is the recycling of solar panel glass. And as well as we have some and batteries as well, solar panels and batteries, and some of these are actually substandard equipment that comes into have the possibility of coming into Jamaica. And the good thing is that we have identified these and we have put system in place to monitor the equipment coming in, so to still facilitate trade and economic growth, to bring about that benefit to climate that comes with climate change, but also to protect our consumers, which is critically important. Also, from the having the standards body working with the ministry with responsibility is also very important, because we are assisting them to get that message out there and doing it in an efficient way, exposing them to standards as well as getting into the school system. And so we have the universities and their the leaders also partnering with us, and is on board with all the activities, most of the activities related to climate change. So it is very important that we have the different leaders in the different spaces on board, and so what we get is buying from just about every sector within industry, within both private and public partnership, and that helps to drive the message that we want to get out in terms of climate change and help us achieve our overall objective in this area.
Thanks for that, Tafara, and it's a great example, and it shows how we can leverage ambassadors as well to kind of to get the message across, and hopefully some of the people in this room might emerge as ambassadors and help us to put the tools in the hands of the people that need them the most. And so I think we've covered a lot of excellent ground here, and I'd like to open it up in a minute in case there's any questions. But before I do that, maybe I'll just give each of you an opportunity to provide us with a sort of a closing statement or kind of your cap up of what we've really talked about here, but also any key messages that you would have regarding the importance of vulnerability and risk assessment, but also how to use the right tools. Benoit, if we could start with you.
Okay. Thank you. First of all, I was very impressed listening to you, Veronica, and on some of the very key actions, and then it makes it real when you listen to those examples and how the adaptation standard is applied. That specific standard. So for me, what's important is that we'll continue. What we are doing with those standards is to so we did some training. We already started in the fall. We did some online training in English, French, Spanish, and Arabic. So and reaching out online to a lot of people. The training goes for maybe around an hour where we go very deep, but we go step by step explaining the training. That's something I want to continue in the next few months. And the interest is so big that I want to do that with other standards under my group. So that's something that I think is important, because it's to reach out so that people knows about the standard, and then we'll look at different ways. And since I took over that chair position a few months ago, that's one of my goals, to reach out to different stakeholders, and I think it's a good way, training and other means, to ensure that the standards will be known and used, of course, in the communities.
Thanks for that, Benoit. And I think capacity development and training did come up a couple of times in the conversation, and I think it is a really important aspect of this, and it is how we bring the tools to life and put them into practice and put them into use. And so one of the other really great things that was just announced actually today here at COP is that ISO has received funding through the Global Environment Faculty to do training on these standards specifically in developing countries. And so the efforts you're talking about are about to ramp up, and this is, I think, a very good news story for a lot of people. So I want to go over to you, Veronica. Final thoughts and key takeaways.
I think it's fantastic to have standards, but they need to be implemented correctly. So I'd say if the attention, I hope the attention moves to a very fast, effective adoption. And I guess I'm reiterating a message, but whether I look at what happened after Ian in the US, or earthquakes in Japan, or the Rome floods, 10 years ago in Rome in Australia, we're looking at each and every time standards were improved, standards were correctly adopted, the cost of insurance went down between 30 and 60%, and those populations, infrastructures, economic activities continue to be protected. So it's of fundamental importance that we really walk the talk. And I'm very happy if whatever way I can help you as a community bring the benefit, the transition into real money, because you do fantastic work and we depend on you to create that confidence in the economic system to do the right things.
Thank you, Veronica, and I love the message. I also love the data, which, as we know, is something else that the standard helps us to focus on and use correctly. So, Tafara, over to you. Final thoughts and comments on this important conversation.
Definitely. All right, so one of the things, even from my own experience here, is awareness building. Just building awareness around the standards, helping persons to understand the standard, and giving technical assistance to implementation. Even locally, when we look locally, we have our local government who is responsible, have direct responsibility to work with communities and persons in communities to test buildings, to ensure that they're building correctly, the space is good for building. And what you find sometimes is that the technical skills, they are limited, and there's a need there for capacity development. So we keep repeating that, and it's really because it's very critical to us achieving our objective. So capacity development is very important, bringing about awareness around the standard, continuing to partner with universities, because some of the information that did come to us in terms of when we were doing our planning process and looking at our risk assessment was from the universities, right? So we got data as it relates to land use and land use change over time, as well as some of our rivers that are going underground, and the impact of that came from our universities. So there's a need to continue research in the area, to continue partnership with academia, as well as like I said, technical assistance. And the Bureau of Standards, luckily for us, we did establish a unit that we call the Client Services Unit. And what that unit does is to partner with persons in industry. We walk them through standards. We help them with the implementation process by pairing them with experts to help them to get to that finish line of implementing those requirements. And that, I would say, is definitely going to be very important going forward, because the concept of climate change, adaptation, climate risk assessment, it's new for us, especially in the Caribbean. The standards are generally new, and for us, we are in the process of establishing our committees, and we have identified our key stakeholders, which is another important point, having those key stakeholders on our committees that can take the message back from inside the Bureau of Standards into the general area is going to be very important for us. And so what we did is identify these stakeholders And we are in the process of establishing our committee, and we want them on board as we adopt these standards, the 14,090, 91, 92, as well as that for greenhouse gas that I kind of reference right now, but definitely those standards. And we are looking to do an adoption with non-objection after they have completed the review process.
That's fantastic. Thank you for putting the spotlight on that leadership, but also giving us a good overview of how to start on the right foot and the things that we really need to consider. So I'd like to now open it up because I think we've covered a lot of ground, but it's also a very complex topic, and I'd like to ask if there's anybody in the audience or online that has any questions for our panel.
Thank you. It's a very interesting topic today called the adaptation. Usually we talk about most of the topic is mitigation. Adaptation is just like Bernard said. Now we have a couple of ISO standard can be followed. So we have the whole structure, the adaptation, and also the risk assessment, vulnerability assessment, which done been done, the ISO 14091, and also the planning one after the risk. And my question is the standards now is the it's quite difficult to the some of the audience to get. So it's old topic, especially the standard in ISO 14060, ISO 207 and SA7, and it's any possibility to get the standard download and used by free. I don't know, maybe it's a topic to ISO maybe. And also to get more audience and more users to use the climate change standards, especially both mitigation and adaptation. And the second question is is it possible to have the best practice, like the lady said, is to sharing with all the developing countries and also developed countries facing the same crisis globally. So I think maybe have the the communication stage and maybe some the social media and also the some platform can share the use case. Yes, that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, and maybe I'll try to address part of the first question, which is about accessibility myself, if the panel doesn't mind, because one of the things that I spoke to earlier was the effort to, on the part of ISO, to get funding to do some of that capacity development and put the standard and the tools, but also the practical training and approaches in terms of how to use it into the hands of users, and in particularly in developing countries and in places where that capacity is needed. And so I think that shows a concerted response to the needs that we're seeing out there in the field, and looking at how to do that. I think another great example is, we've had some fantastic information on case studies of application here today, as well as deep dives into how data is being leveraged and how you're looking at how standards are being applied and how that's affecting things like insurance rates. And so I don't know if maybe there's a volunteer to speak to that. Veronica, please.
I'll just maybe build on what Brady said. So I understand that the access question, especially where there isn't enough capacity within a market to operate with confidence, can be an obstacle. I'm obviously not from ISO, but what I can offer is we've been the way we've been able to bring the analysis that I described to a vast application cases is through multilateral development banks and in general DFIs. because they go about funding many of these big, large infrastructural projects that have a developmental objective behind them, and they can do that so typically at also more attractive financial terms. But they need to make sure that they are also helping build assets and physical realities that are well adapted for the future. So they themselves use some of the methodologies that and the tools I was referring to before as part of their lending program. And in that, obviously, will interface with the Ministry of Infrastructure, the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Transport, et cetera, et cetera. So that's certainly one way. The other way that I think it helps, and it's the other side of money, yes, insurance is one consideration, but most critically, they all try to mobilize private capital to do the right things, right? They can't fund all of it themselves. So if you can demonstrate that those projects are truly resilient and they are compliant with the standards that ISO has put in place, it's so much easier to get the private capital to flow in. Because what we need is if you're an investor, you're looking, where are you going to deploy your capital? You're looking for the best risk return. And so if we can demonstrate that these projects have a good balanced risk return, and they're further supported at the risk through, some concessionaire money, and the banks put, meaningful funding themselves, all of a sudden you have a huge multiplicative effect, all for the benefit of more underdeveloped market or low middle income countries. So I think that's also a mechanism through which we can see that technical assistance really come to life.
Thanks very much for that, and I think it gives us a lot of information about what we can use, and also some things to reflect on as we embark on that journey of building out this toolkit, but also helping to build capacity and put it into the hands of the people that need it most. So we only have a few minutes left, so I want to put it back to the group one more time. Any further questions? And don't be shy while we have all of this knowledge up here on the stage with us today. Please.
Thank you for the fantastic panel. And Veronica, I had a question for you. Adam Stingemore from Australia, and I'm fascinated to hear that you have worked with Australians to price the delta in an adaptation sense. My question is that scalable around the world? And if so, what efforts are needed to sort of get it moving?
So, thank you, Adam. So I think there is the reality is adaptation has to be local, but we wouldn't be able to do what we do as a global organization if we did not design it to be globally portable. So the way we tackle it is, if you will, peril per peril, and then by type of intervention. And so when it comes to flood, today we can, anywhere around the world, do an analysis not only about the future scenarios, as I said, 50 years out, but you can overlay any type of engineered or nature-based intervention and get the reliably modeled approach of with or without that. That we can do anywhere in the world. In some places it's 3 meters by 3 meters, which is really granular. And in other places, maybe it's a kilometer by kilometer, but that's immediately portable. My wish would be to be able to do that also, for instance, in the context of heat, which is chronic. It's a very different type of manifestation. It takes time, etc. So we're building our bridges, but we are very keen. Look, risk is so core to what we do. We have a vested incentive to make sure that insurance is available, affordable, and appreciated. And for that to happen, we need to be in a world that is properly de-risked. So all investment that we do in the research, with academia, with tech startups, to get all the, the latest and the greatest that we can come across, we do it because we're helping ourselves help the world. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. And it looks like we're out of time, but I know I have really enjoyed this conversation and the amount of information and knowledge that we've been able to put out there. What I love is the way it demonstrates the way we're working together to put these tools into action and enable them through incentives and everything else, but also with standards as the core tool that helps us to figure out how we actually implement it and move it forward on the ground. So just a big thank you to all three of you for this today. And that's it for us. So thank you.
Thank you. course. Thank you.
Sorry if there were a few curveballs.
That's fine.
Yeah, it was all good.
But I love the example.